I've been reading a novel whose main character, Walt Longmire, the sheriff of Absaroka County, Wyoming, has having flashbacks to his days in the Vietnam War. Something in his present life is stimulating these flashbacks. And it got me to thinking about how we look at things from different perspectives. The perspective of the guy who's in the foxhole with the bullets flying overhead and the mortars going off is a bit different than the guy who's in the command tent checking in on the radio, which is different from the Pentagon, which may even not even know the battle is going on, but of course they know what the meaning and importance of that battle is, which is different from the historian who years later comes and writes about the war, and that battle may be totally forgotten and ignored, or the historian might decide that it was one of the pivotal moments of the entire war. The perspective from which we are looking at something and interpreting the meaning of something makes a difference. I had the privilege on being top of the World Trade Centers years ago, and on the tourist level, they had something really cool and a bit scary. They had a place you could sit down and look down the glass straight down the building. You're sitting looking at glass, sitting down, looking down the side of the building. Then we went on top outside. That was quite a thrill. And then a few years later, I was flying back from Europe, and I was able to see the World Trade Centers from 35,000 feet. Little matchsticks. Totally recognizable little matchsticks. And then, tragically, a few years later, I was able to stand at the hole where those buildings had once stood. All of those trips, all of those were very awe-inspiring moments. But what a difference the perspective makes, doesn't it? From inside the building to 30,000, 5,000 feet to standing at the hole. Last week we spoke about God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, and today we're going to be speaking a bit more about Joseph at the very end of Genesis. From 15, actually goes to chapter 50. So all of the stuff that happens between chapter 15 and the covenant with Abraham and what happens to Joseph could cover 7 to 8 seasons of a TV series. But I'm afraid some of the stories are too sordid to put on television, and they'd never make it past the censors. This is part of a sermon series called The Big Story, and I'm grabbing major events in the history of God's people. Joseph particularly is a transitional figure because Joseph ultimately, not in the story that we read today, but later on, ultimately is responsible for bringing the Hebrew people, the children of Israel, into Egypt. And much to my surprise, as I reread Genesis this week and got to the end of the story, realized that he was very significantly responsible, although not by his intention, but responsible for enslaving the people of Israel in Egypt. I'm not going to tell that part of the story. You can go read the last of Genesis for yourself on that one. But what I want us to focus on, the point of view from which I want us to look at these stories, we're going to do a quick overview, is how we live out the covenant relationship with God. God chose Abraham, brought him to a promised land, made promises to him, and then sealed those promises with a covenant. How are God and the people living out that covenant relationship? Because that applies directly to us. We are the heirs of the promises. We are the people of God. So the way people are responding and the way God responds to living out that covenant relationship is vital for our relationship as a people and as individuals. So I'm going to fly over at about the 30,000 foot level for a good part of Genesis, and we're going to be like a tour guide and point out a few things out the window as we go by. Then we're going to circle around Joseph a little bit, pay more attention to Joseph, who's 3 generations removed from Abraham. We're going to see how God's covenant project is going. Well, we know that Abraham and Sarah was barren for all a long time, and finally, God blesses her with her own child, Isaac. And God makes a covenant with Abraham in chapter 17 and requires him, as his part of the covenant, to apply circumcision to all the males in his household. So circumcision is a sign of the covenant. It's something the males bear in their body, saying we are part of God's promises, and we have made a covenant with God as God has made with us. Of course, having Isaac, as old as they were, was like having their great-grandchild, you know? It must have been, just imagine how foolish they were with that kid, you know? How much they must have spoiled him. But one of the most shocking chapters in the Bible to me is chapter 22 of Genesis, where Abraham understands God telling him to take his young son, who's this promise that he and his wife had waited for decades, to take him to Mount Moriah and builds an altar, ties his son onto the altar, and he believes God's telling him to sacrifice his son to God. The story is told dispassionately, only from like some bare facts, but the emotion that must have gone through everyone there is just incredible. So Abraham's willing to go through with it, but then God sends an angel and stops his hand. We find out that God is just testing him. And it says in verses 16 to 17, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, which is a repetition of the original promise, because you have obeyed my voice. So in the end, although Abraham has been somewhat wishy-washy in his faith at times, and the covenant was actually to bolster his own faith and confidence in God fulfilling the promise, here Abraham finally proves himself with that which was most precious to him. Well, Isaac grows up, and they get a wife for him, of course, Rebekah, and it seems to have been the problem that the women have fertility problems for a while, and then at the last bit of their life, God comes through. Well, Rebekah has twins, just has children once, but it's twins, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the first one to be born. Jacob is coming out, but he's grabbing the guy's ankle, so they're saying, man, this guy really wants, they're in a competition here. And as we know from the story, that Jacob was the youngest, but his mother, Rebekah, favored him over Esau. And the mother plots with Jacob to get the birthright, the final blessing, to pass on this line of the promise of Abraham, to Isaac, now to the next generation. Instead of going to the oldest son, which is the custom and is the normal thing, she plots so that this line of blessing will go through Jacob instead. And they're successful in that. And that's quite a story. That's a whole other season of the TV series on its own. And, you know, of course, there's bad blood between the brothers for years. And Jacob goes off because Isaac wants to send him off to marry back in their home country, back in Ur of the Chaldeans, to a family. Laban was actually a family member. And Jacob and Rachel hit it off, and they want to get married. The problem is, so he asked Laban, her father, for his hand in marriage, and Laban said, wait a minute, she has an older sister. You got to marry the older sister off first before the younger sister can marry. It's not like today. I mean, women are sort of like part of the property inherent to benefit the clan. It wasn't one of these, oh, I fall in love with you and everything's wonderful kind of stories. That's not the way they handled things back then. But in the end, Laban said, okay, you can marry Rachel. But what happens? On the wedding night, Jacob is terribly drunk. And he wakes up in the morning after his wedding and finds the older daughter, sister Leah, in his bed instead of Rachel. I would love to see this TV story done by Seinfeld. Wouldn't you? Just imagine the confusion around all of this and how funny it could be made. Jacob ends up having to work an extra 7 years to get Rachel as his wife legally. So he ends up with 2 wives who are sisters. I imagine those family reunions were really interesting. In the end, just to make the story short, they have 12 sons. Jacob has 12 sons and 1 daughter named Dinah. Those 12 sons become the tribes of Israel. Each of those sons is like the head of a tribe in the end. But there's one father, Jacob, who God changes his name to Israel later on. So when you hear the sons of Israel, it's Jacob. His name has been changed by God to Israel. And the 12 sons, but there are 4 mothers, okay? 4 mothers. 2 of them are wives and 2 of them are handmaids. You can go read those fun stories. So you can see that you cannot apply the mores of the New Testament period to the period of Abraham and back then. It was a bit different kind of a thing. We sort of look over that kind of stuff. Well, Rachel, the real passionate love interest for Jacob, has fertility problems. This is a repeating problem in the story. And so that's why she gave her handmaid for him to have children, etc. But at the end, in a more advanced age, God does bless her, and she has Joseph. So Joseph is this really long-awaited for special child for Jacob and Rachel. And he is spoiled rotten. That's why he got the multicolored coat. Of course, he's young, and so the father uses him for all kinds of special things. And he's the favorite son. Unfortunately, Rachel has one more pregnancy, and she has another son named Benjamin, but she dies in childbirth. So she doesn't really get to know Benjamin. And so Joseph obviously is the special child to Jacob. Joseph is just an incredible story. I encourage you, I don't care what your age, to go and reread the story at the end of Genesis about Joseph. His story is the story of a classic mythical hero. It takes more twists and turns than a soap opera. I tell you, it's absolutely incredible. He's the favorite son of a wealthy man, and because he is so spoiled and doted on, his brothers hate him, as if some of you may have been in situations like that. But they're particularly angry, not only because of the favoritism, but because God has given him an ability to dream and to interpret dreams. And in one of his dreams, he dreams that his brothers someday will bow down to him, and it infuriates him. He says in chapter 37, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more. They hated him before he told them the dream. They hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. So his brothers were so disgusted they wanted to kill him. And we read part of that story this morning. And one of the younger brothers, Reuben, persuaded him to save his life. But he ends up being sold to some traders who take him to Egypt. And there he is sold into slavery. I'm not sure I can put myself in Joseph's shoes very well. Imagine the shock of being a pampered, favorite child of a wealthy person. Then you find your siblings want to kill you. You're sold into slavery, taken to another country. Your dad doesn't even know that you're alive. He thinks you're dead. And you're sold into slavery in Egypt. Would you think your life is over? Would you have much faith in God at that point? You'd either be crying out in desperation or turn your back on God out of anger. You abandoned me, God, so I'm going to abandon you. But actually, Joseph, for a slave, wasn't in a bad place. This guy was captain of the guard. He was high up. So I'm sure he had a nice place to stay. His clothing was taken care of and everything. But the problem was, you're just property. And Potiphar's wife sexually harassed him. And when he refused her advances, she told a story on him and got him thrown in prison. But God was with Joseph. Because of this ability to interpret dreams, eventually, one of the guys that he interpreted a dream for, the cupbearer to the king that was in prison, and Joseph told a dream that came true. And told a dream that came true. So when the Pharaoh has a dream that none of his wise men and people can interpret, the cupbearer remembers, oh, there was this guy in prison I was in prison with who told me a dream, and it came out just like he said. So he brings Joseph to him, and God gives Joseph the interpretation of the dream, which is the dream of the fat cows and the skinny cows that come out of the Nile, basically saying you're going to have 7 years of really good harvest and prosperity, and then 7 years of famine. Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph and this that he makes him the number 2 person in Egypt, elevated from slave to the number 2 guy in Egypt. I think you get dizzy from the vertigo of climbing a building that fast, don't you? There's no elevator can go that fast. He went from nothing to the top of the heap, literally in a heartbeat. And so he administered the problem with 7 lean years, harvest years. In Pharaoh's name, he bought a percentage of all of the harvest and stored it. And then when the bad years came, they would sell grain to people to help keep them alive. And in the second year of famine, of the second of 2, Jacob, now called Israel, sends his sons to Egypt to buy food because they're starving. So they come, and it's just the most moving story. I really encourage you to go and read it. The reconciliation and how Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers and forgives them. And he ends up saving their lives. He has them go back and bring their father Israel and all of that. And this is how the Hebrew people and the children of Israel end up in Egypt, because Joseph is now the number 2. He saves their lives during a severe famine. And when he brings to the attention of Pharaoh, Pharaoh gives them some of the choice land in the Nile Delta, Goshen. It wasn't a bad place. This was good land. They were not brought in as slaves. They came in as a people. The way they became enslaved was that near the end of the famine, the people had to buy the grain, and when they ran out of money, they gave their cattle and when to buy the grain. When they had nothing left, it says, you'll read this in Genesis, the people offered themselves in slavery to the Pharaoh in exchange for the food, okay? And that is in the process. Joseph set that system up. So that is the process by which Israel became enslaved in Egypt. But listen to these words of Joseph after he's reconciled with his brothers. In Genesis 50, verse 20, even though you intended to harm me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people. God is protecting his investment in the chosen people and in the bloodline through Joseph. Joseph is in line of the succession of the promises. And although his brothers intended to kill him and get him out of the way, God used their evil deed through a whole series of incredible things to make it a life-saving one. So they intended to kill him, but he ended up saving the family's life and continuing the legacy of the children of Israel. Well, let's land the plane now. We've had our little tour guide. And let's talk about what we've been seeing. The question is how the covenant relationship between God and his people is lived out. Genesis 50:20 gives us that interpretation statement there that God is doing something at a deeper level with a long-term perspective in the midst of our daily living. From the perspective that Joseph was living and his brothers, they're just going through normal life. But from a different perspective, and from the perspective of God's plan in relationship with them, God is doing something bigger and deeper than they're aware of, at a deeper level and with a longer-term perspective. This is why all of us from time to time need to take a 30,000-foot view of our own lives and look back, whether that be a short period of time or a much longer period of time. We need a perspective from a different angle, from a different distance from time to time to look at our lives. And then we need to ask some key questions. God, what are you doing in my life? We need to ask that question. God, what are you doing in my life? What are you trying to do and work out in my life? And we need to ask that question, God, what do you want to do in my life? But then we need to ask the question from our perspective. How am I responding to God in my life? Am I cooperating with God? Am I seeking God? Am I cooperating with God in his plan? Am I trying to seek that out? Am I totally ignoring God, just living my own life and not even giving a second thought to God in my relationship with God and God's plans for my life that they might have? Or am I sort of aware of God's plans and I'm resisting them? I feel that there's a battle of the wills. God wants me to do one thing and I want to do something else. We need to pause from time to time and ask ourselves those kind of questions. What's God wanting to do with my life? What is God doing? What can I discern that God's doing? But then, wait a minute, how about my role? Am I ignoring God and not even giving it a second thought? Am I resisting God? Or am I cooperating, God, and I'm totally open? Am I living it from the inside out, as the song said this morning? Well, as we look over these stories in the book of Genesis of God's people and the covenant relationship being lived out, there is one constant through them all. God is faithful. God is faithful. As we look at this series of stories, that is the only constant throughout. God is faithful to his creative purpose. God is going to fulfill his creative purpose. God is faithful to his promises and to the word that he gives to people. God is totally faithful. God is faithful to his promises. God is true to his own being. God is good and God is love. God is faithful. God is true to God's own self and being. God's true to his creative purpose. God is true to his promise and his word. But when we look at what happened in contrast on the human side, we see a mixture of faithfulness and unfaithfulness. We see a picture of our lives, don't we? We see a picture of faithfulness and unfaithfulness. And sometimes it gets so messy, you wonder, how in the world is God going to create a people that loves him out of this mess? Right? If you read Genesis, that it comes through. And yet the promises, God is faithful to his promises passed down through the patriarchs and the matriarchs. To Abraham, through Abraham blesses Isaac, who blesses Jacob, who blesses Joseph. But man, there's a whole lot of messiness in between. You know, we have some great moments in our lives where we're really tuned into God, where we surrender and give our hearts to him. We experience God's blessings. We find that God uses us in important ways. And then we have those times. We want to sell our brother or throw him in a pit or something, right? We have times where we let God down, we let others down, we let ourselves down. And what's the answer to all of this? Well, the answer actually is quite simple and profound. God is faithful. God is faithful. God will always be true to his being, which is holy love. God will always come through. As I've thought about these things this week, I realize there's two basic approaches to how God is faithful. These are two, determinism and free will are like two ends of a spectrum. There's a whole spectrum in between, but they're two poles of a spectrum. Some see that God's way of fulfilling his promises and God's way of making his will come about is by exercising sovereign control over everything. God's a control freak. So God completes his promises and word through raw, sovereign control and power. This is one extreme of the spectrum. And, well, I won't go into any history of that, but that is one extreme. God's controlling everything, so even the bad in my life, God somehow put it there. I knew a lady who felt that God gave people cancer for a reason. I disagreed with her totally and told her so many times. But she was convinced. She had a deterministic approach, understanding of how God fulfills his plans and will. The other end of extreme of the spectrum is total free will, where people choose their own fate. People are free to cooperate with God, to resist God, to ignore God, obstruct God. It sort of leaves God's will subject to the whims of the people. So in the end, free will causes a major challenge to God fulfilling his will, because if these people are uncontrollable, so to speak, and are just given free rein, how in the world is God going to fulfill his promises or his purposes? Well, I believe that it's somewhere in between. I want to make two affirmations, and I believe that these affirmations speak of approaches that we see in the stories. Two affirmations. First of all, of how God lives out the covenant and how God brings about his will and purposes. First of all, God's strategy, as I've told you before, is incarnational. Incarnation, God becoming flesh. God works with people within human history. God has decided to work with people. God doesn't just magically, forcefully do something like that and throw lightning bolts like Zeus from Mount Olympus. No, God works with the history, within the culture, within events, and within the decisions of people in their own time. This is why we see understanding of God and faithful living actually evolves and develops throughout the Bible times. God is working with his people within their history, with their times and their cultures. We don't see God jumping on, getting in trouble with them for giving handmaids, the wives giving handmaids, so that the guy can perpetuate the tribe more. If you get into the New Testament times, that would be totally unacceptable. There is a development as people, God works with people in developing their understanding of God, and God works with that. So God deals with us in our time and with our culture as well. That is, God works with human reality as it is. But, the second affirmation, God strategizes to achieve his purpose while taking into account the freedom of human choice. God is very, very wise and very subtle and ingenious, who works with the vicissitudes of human freedom and works a strategy to carry out his will in a dynamic, fluid kind of process. We see both of these things happening. Look, God chose Abraham. That is a real sovereign kind of act. But then as Abraham waffles and other things, God makes a covenant with him. And other things, and we see Abraham throwing a kink in from time to time, but God working with that and strategizing and showing mercy and grace and other kind of things, and sometimes using the hardships that result from their bad decisions to work out his will. So God works out his will in this fluid, dynamic process because God works relationally, not mechanically. Okay? God isn't using mechanics. God's using relationship and heart. God's not forcing things. God is working dynamically with things. So God is working within our reality in our situations. But it's important that we cooperate with God. We need to do our part. We can make it very hard, or we can make it very easy. I love that passage I studied last week, 1 Corinthians 2:9. What no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of the human being conceived is what God has prepared for those who love him. You have no idea what God can do in your life if you cooperate with him, you know? To cooperate and say yes, to go along, give him your heart, to live from the inside out, like the song said. God can do so much, so many great things. But when we do get willful and messed up and stubborn and we sin, we can return to God. We can be restored. None of you here is beyond that. God can take our messes, our bad decisions, our willfulness, and even the things we're victims of, even terrible tragedies that happen in our lives, and use them towards a higher purpose. He can take all of the nastiness in your life, and God can actually use that for a higher purpose. The Apostle Paul expressed it beautifully in Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. God is goodness. In his very essence is goodness. God works for good for those who love God and called according to his purpose. We are called to God's purpose. Each and every one of us here. We are heirs of the promises to Abraham. We are God's representatives. And our purpose is to show the world what God is like through the way we live and with our words. We are God's people. And our story is joined to the story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Joseph. We are part of the continuation of that story. And God has been faithful. God is faithful. God will be faithful. So let us resolve to mirror God's faithfulness with our faithfulness as we serve and share life with our faithful God. Let's bow our heads in prayer.